Right. So where I believe we left off last time we were talking is talking about Sigmund Freud's and Freudian theory. And I would encourage everyone to kind of take a look at both Freud's work and Neo-Freudians. Neo-Freudians tended to de-emphasize the role of sexuality, as some added human relationships as our basic drive. Others included things like competency and control. So there is some variation to what Freud was saying and his followers. So it's kind of a little interesting history of, as far as we're concerned. But there's just some key takeaway points that I want us to take that of course I want us to take away with. And the first one is that this notion of unconscious, whether Freud was correct about unconscious driving our behavior and whatnot, a lot of times when people come to us, they're not sure why they keep following into these patterns of behavior. And these patterns of whether it's continually getting in abusive relationships or continuing to get in through addiction in those areas. And in a lot of ways, it's kind of our job to kind of explore with them about things they might even not even recognize about themselves. The other thing that we do still use from Freudian theory is the idea of defense mechanisms. We call them thinking errors now, and the list has been expanded. And I'd encourage you all to, Google thinking errors uh, use for therapy, and you'll see a few more. These tend to be the most recognized and the most ones that can help you guide your whether you should slow up, slow down, or speed up the group process. So those are some of the takeaway points that I'd like everyone to consider as we move forward. So the next theory is humanistic theory. So I'm going to place this in some historical context. Okay, is we have psychoanalysis, Freudian theory coming up, and it's and while at the same time, I'll just kind of we have the behaviorist movement coming up, and we'll talk about behavioral therapy here in just a few minutes. Um, but there was some issues with both of these. Okay. In Freudian theory, the person doesn't have control because the reason we do what we do is because of our unconscious drives. Okay. And so, and for behaviorism, we don't do what we do out of free choice because everything we do is based on a learned pattern history. So in both of these kind of theories at their most theoretical level, and none of us are here in this classroom because we chose to be here. Either our learning history put us here, or we have some drives that have put us here in order to make us, either more attractive to a mating partner or be more defensive for our family or more, well, whatever it may be. And that takes away human volition, human choice. And there came along a humanistic theory uh, that kind of didn't like this whole idea of our behaviors being determined by something. And so in the 1950s, there was a theory, philosophical theory that became really popular at the time, and it was called existentialism. Okay, I'm just going to rehearse just the basics of existentialism. It's a much more deeper philosophy than what I'm presenting here, but it kind of leads us to the humanistic approach. In existential theory, and you got to remember at that time we've just been through World War One, World War Two. We're starting to deal with Vietnam and conflict in the Asian Peninsula. We have the nuclear threat starting to uh, ramp up. And so the world was in a pretty chaotic spot at the time. And so a lot of people kind of were attracted to this idea of existentialism because existentialism is a philosophy that says we are born into a meaningless universe. There's no meaning to anything in the world. The earth has no meaning. You have no meaning. Nothing has a meaning. Okay. And so to create meaning in life, this is why human beings created things like religion, education, government, and all of these things. So they were human creations to bring meaning to one's life. Okay. So now how does that lead to the humanistic approach? Well, the thing is if everything is meaningless, nothing is determined. Therefore, humans live with free will. You see that path. If we are born to a meaningless world, that means nothing we do is predetermined. Okay. And therefore, we have true free will to act and behave how we think we should act and behave, and make decisions that aren't based on some predetermined pathway. Okay. And this was very attractive to the humanistic approach because we have all these therapists and counselors dealing with this deterministic idea and sitting here going, well, these clients, do they have choice over whether they have this disorder or this problem? And how are we supposed to help to change it? So this humanistic idea really took off. Let's see. Let me make sure I have these guys' name now. Uh, Okay, so so we're at this precipice. Now, the thing that I do want to state up front is just like Freudian theory, this theory is going to come out of the counseling field from for working with clients and whatnot. And the other thing that I want everyone to pay attention to is regardless of whether you use a cognitive behavioral therapy or a cognitive or a emotive therapy or any other type of therapy, um, all counseling sessions start with this theory. Okay, so usually in the first at least 3 to 6 sessions, most counselors will use the humanistic approach because the humanistic approach emphasizes the relationship between the client and the therapist. Okay. And so that's why I really want you to pay attention to this because even in the group process, the first couple sessions is all about relationship building. Okay. Now, one of the important aspects of humanistic theory is if we have free will, then we've made choices in our life. That means that we all have the capacity to solve a problem, but it is the job of the therapist to guide that client to come to this kind of self-realization of why they're behaving the way they are. And this probably gives us more of that stereotype of someone going into a counseling session because pure humanistic therapy, the therapist never gives their advice. They never give, this is what I'm diagnosing you with. This is kind of, if you think about some of the sitcoms and stuff, the person comes in and talks to the therapist and says, I've experienced this. And the therapist basically says, oh, tell me more about that. Oh, how did that make you feel? Oh, how did that make? And you see, they never give their advice. And of course, in the sitcom, that's always, wow, how was the therapy session? And they go, I don't know. He didn't tell me anything. Okay. But in pure humanistic therapy, it's believed that the person already has the capacity, and the therapist's job is there to provide a condition in which that person can freely explore what's going on in their world and find a solution. Okay. Um, okay. So let's talk about the evolution of humanistic theory because it starts with two individuals who are most well known for it, and then there's some more modern individuals as well. And this is Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers. And if you've ever taken some HR classes or lessons, or you've taken Psych 101 or something like that, or there's some memes on the internet about it, this pyramid should look pretty familiar. And I'm sure it's even taught in some of the social work classes and whatnot. This is Maslow, what's called Maslow's hierarchy of need. Okay. And what Maslow proposed is that we all have a primary motivation to become a fully potentialized person, that really what motivates humans is to come to a complete understanding of oneself. And you term this self-actualization or self-fulfillment. But he proposed that there are things that we need in our world that need to be aligned in order for us to focus on becoming a self-actualized person. Okay. And it starts here at the base with our physiological needs. So we need food, water, warmth, rest, shelter, all of those basic biological needs. And then when we have those needs met, we have to have our safety needs met. We need to feel secure. We need to feel like for example, there's no violence in the home, those kinds of things. We live in a safe neighborhood. Okay. Once we have these met, then we need our relationship needs met. So, good friends, good, healthy, intimate relationships, good family relations, and those things. And then once those are met, we then need what's called esteem needs. We need to think well about ourselves. We need to feel like we can progress and become a better person. Okay. And then and only then can we become self-actualized. Okay. Now, now let me explain. So I mentioned HR, I mentioned therapy. So let's just kind of review these and why people in human resources use it. If we think about it, this is the basis of a healthy workplace. Okay. So physiological needs, do we get paid well enough to meet our basic needs, to meet our bills for our house and food and water and all of those things? Do we feel safe in our workplace? Is there security? Is there, fire drill maps? Do we do things to promote safety in the workplace? Do we have the opportunity to interact with our coworkers and meet and have even those non like the little birthday parties now and then and those kinds of things. And then we companies need to provide self-growth opportunities, so professional development, training, those kinds of things to meet our individual needs. And this is the basis of a healthy organization. And when you look at organizations that do really well, they tend to provide all four of these elements in the workplace. Okay. Now, I want to return to our field because this is also the basis of a good psychosocial assessment. So when a person first comes into us and we do the assessment interviews and everything else. These are the things that we're asking. Do they have access to food, water, and shelter, home, housing? Do they live in a safe place? Is there domestic violence in the house? Is there other safety risks that this person has? Do they have healthy relationships? Do they have healthy, intimate relationships? What is their relationship with their family? What is their relationship with friends and coworkers? How do they feel about themselves? So are they depressed? Are they anxious? What do they think of themselves? What is their self-esteem? Okay. And as a social worker or a counselor, we then take this into account, and even before we might even put them in a group or something, we might connect them with the housing. We may recommend they go to a domestic violence shelter, for example. We'll start helping them look at their relationships. We might refer them to their primary care provider if they have depressive symptoms or something, to maybe consider a medication or something like that. So just consider these things. These are things that we assess. Now, at the group level, we use these when we have our clients do check-ins. I kind of mentioned this last week. A good start to a group is you go around and you do, you can do what's called thinking check-ins, or how was your week, or did you implement, just there's a wide range of them that we'll get to in the class. And these are the things that you're listening for. Um, uh, did they mention that they are getting evicted? Did they mention, that, they were bullied or something like that? Are they having issues in a relationship? Did they have a hit to their self-esteem? And you're listening to this because these are things that should be sending up red flags. Because if you think about someone who, let's say, is getting evicted and let's say was beat up by a bully, they're not going to be able to focus in that group setting. So it would be a good idea to take down some notes. One, at break, then approach them and see, have you seen your case manager or your individual counselor, those kinds of things. Make those recommendations and referrals. And then remember that, because you're going to have to come back to those topics once they are secure and safe in their place, because they're not going to be there for that group. And I think we all understand this. I know many of you probably have things going on in your life, so you're not fully engaged in this class, right? And that's why we record it, and that's why we have the notes and the PowerPoints posted, because we can't always be fully engaged because things in our life. Okay. So now I'm going to move to Carl Rogers, because what Carl Rogers is going to say is that the job of the therapist is to provide an environment where an individual can come and they can say anything they want, judgment free. In fact, when we look at research on individual therapy, about 80 to 90% of people who go to individual therapy don't come back after about the second session. And we've always wondered, why is there such a high dropout rate from treatment? And we're like, do they not like their therapist? Is it too expensive? Do they find it ridiculous? All of these things kind of have been hypothesized. But the fact is that when we talk to people and we talk, why didn't you return, da, 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 the majority of those people say it's because they felt relief from their symptoms. And that was intriguing. And so we dug a little bit deeper, and I said, well, what do you think created this relief in your symptoms? And they simply said it was the very first time in their life that they could talk about anything they want to, anything that they're going through, any feeling or emotion that they couldn't tell their intimate partner or their close best friend or something else, because There was no judgment there. I could sit and not be judged for everything that I went through. And just having that opportunity relieved the symptoms that I had. And so, and again, this is why I'm bringing this up. This is why it's important to create this environment where a person feels non-judged, feels like they can come and say anything and not feel like they're going to get in trouble, and all of those things. Now that's of course within the confines of confidentiality laws, right? Which we will get to when we get to the ethics section, but that's where we are. The reason why I'm bringing up Carl Rogers at this point is you noted that I didn't give really good definition of what Maslow meant by self-actualization. And it's actually because I kind of prefer Carl Rogers. Okay. So Carl Rogers theorized, and actually there was some predecessors to him that actually kind of built this theory. It was Carl Rogers through therapy kind of provided the evidence for it. But basically what is stated in this is that we have a real self. This real self is who is operating here today and in this place. It is who you are, your good faults, your bad faults, it's the basket of your life. Okay. And then we have this ideal self. Okay. This ideal self is that person we think we ought to be. So we ought to be the straight A student. We ought to be the greatest mom or dad in the world. We ought to be the greatest athlete or this different version that we want to be. Okay. And what Carl Rogers found through his research and therapy and whatnot is that the further and further that the ideal self and the real self are apart from each other, the greater dysfunction you found with the client. So the greater amount of anxiety, the greater amount of depression when a person has a ideal self that is completely, or not completely, but so far away from who they really are. Okay. And so what Carl Rogers theorized is that a actualized person is when your ideal self and real self are one and the same. Now, that doesn't mean you become your ideal self. You move towards that some, but then you bring your ideal self to appreciate who you are as a real person. And indeed, what this person is a person who accepts themselves completely. Their dark side, their bright side, their bad habits, their good habits, and they completely accept that as a complete person. And what does that do for that individual? Well, if you think about this in its most purest form, if I accept myself completely and totally for who I am, then I can accept others completely and totally for who they are. So it is actually someone who lives basically without prejudices. It leaves someone who lives without discrimination or biases. So on the extreme end, you can see how very, very difficult it is to have this completeness, right? And there's probably only a few handful of people, we just got done with MLK, I would argue, might have been this completely idealized self or actualized self, as I would say. But basically, when those two things become close together, we're able to provide what Carl Rogers referred to as unconditional positive regard. Okay, meaning that you accept a person completely for who they are. If you want to put it in this terms, this is the therapist that could work with pedophiles. This is the person who can work with murderers. This is a person who can, the evilest people in the world. Why? Because they understand that, they have this darkness to them, but that's not the complete person who they are. It's just one of the labels that tends to drive their life. Okay. So, but again, from a therapeutic perspective, and something you want to listen to, is when someone has a completely unrealistic idea of who they should be, and you're wondering why they're sitting in your patient's in the patient chair or the client chair, you might want to come back to this Rogerian idea about bringing the real self and that overly idealized self back to closer together, closer to reality, as you would say. Okay. So beyond that, and these are some of the points made, is that Carl Rogers' theory is what we call a person-centered theory, meaning that the relationship between the client and the therapist isn't about the therapist's expertise. It's not about the therapist's ability to diagnose a person. It's about the person and the person's experience and um, how they're uh, understanding their world. Okay. And there's emphasis that is placed on what's called the self-concept. And this is the individual's overall perceptions and assessments of their abilities, behaviors, and personality. This is where you're really assessing that who they feel they really are and who they really think they ought to be. This is their overall idea of who they are as a person. And it really focuses on not just the problem at hand, but at the person as a complete and whole individual. So again, going back to the person-centered theory, we're not looking at a list of symptoms. We're looking at a complete and total human being. Okay. And of course, what we should all be achieving, trying to achieve as therapists and as group facilitators, is this thing known as unconditional regard, in that we need to accept the values and the being positive towards another person's behaviors and emotions. And I will tell you, sometimes this is difficult when you have clients who have different belief systems than you do. Okay. I remember the first time that where I come from, it's the religious out at that time, it was about 88% Mormons. There were very few Protestants, Catholics, and other Christian-based religions, even though there was some little pockets, but there were less and less, for example, Muslims and Buddhists. And I remember working domestic violence, and a Muslim woman was scheduled to see me, and I knew nothing at the time about that religion. Okay. So in order to make it so I could work with that client, I went home. Well, actually, I went to the bookstore and I bought a book on Muslim religion. I bought the Quran. I still have the Quran at my house, and I've read through it. Why? Because as a therapist, I had the obligation to understand my client, not from my Judeo-Christian world, but from their perspective and their world. Okay. And so sometimes working with people, we have to step back and say, can I give this person unconditional positive regard when when we may have a bias, or we may not have a knowledge, or we may not have a experience with certain individuals. And sometimes it's best to say, I can't work with this individual. There's some cases where you might experience so much bias that it's just you need to have them work with someone else for their benefit and their care. So But this is kind of again, when we get into group work, you're going to have individuals there with different experiences, different ways of life. They might all be there for a common problem, such as addiction, but the roads to that addiction are different for everyone. I remember, you know, in the domestic violence field, I always had to check myself at where I was at, because it always seemed like the basics of domestic violence were the same. In the cycle, all those things. But what I started to realize when I started to get burnt out and those kinds of things is I was projecting those ideas about a domestic violence relationship onto my client. Okay, because I was tired and all these other things going on. I stopped listening to my clients. And that's a really big moment that you should always say. If you start seeing all your clients as the same individual, you need to step back and check yourself, because it's probably you who is seeing them all the same, because everyone comes to us with different experiences and different ways of understanding where they are at. And this is the basis of humanistic theory, is that we need to find that story or that narrative for that individual so they understand it's their experiences. They already come with pretty much the solutions according to humanistic theory. Okay. And again, I just want to bring this point up again because we will be talking about relationship building in the group process. Again, is humanistic theory, just to kind of summarize the takeaway points for this, is pure humanistic therapy used? Not very often. There are some therapists that, just like with psychoanalysts, there's pockets of psychoanalysts, there's pockets of pure humanistic therapists. But the majority of therapists and even group facilitators use humanistic theory in at least the relationship building part of the client professional, quote unquote, therapist, I should say, relationship. Okay. So kind of think about that as we move forward. So we started with Freudian. We kind of came up with the idea that people don't always understand where why they are experiencing the troubles that they're troubling. Now we're starting to build some mechanisms in place. Unconditional positive regard, setting up an environment that makes clients feel safe and comfortable in opening up to start to explore what led individuals into, for example, addiction or mental health issues. All right, real quick in the chat, and I'll ask again for those who aren't comfortable answering questions or being at the end of the class, I'll ask again. Is there any questions about this whole idea of humanistic theory or therapy, I should say? You could put it in the chat or you can unmute yourself. Thank you, Alyssa. Thank you, Linde. All right. All right. Okay. No questions. Okay. All right. So we started with humanistic theory as kind of the beginning parts of therapy, where you're building the relationship. Now we need to have things that we could put in place where individuals can start working on changing their behaviors and their thought processes. And probably the most well-known type of treatment, the ones that's considered quote unquote evidence-based, is what's called CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy. There's another version of that I'll introduce later on in the course, called emotive based cognitive behavioral therapy, but we'll get into that one a little bit later in the class. Um, but the basis of CBT is it's a combination of two types of therapies, behavioral therapy and cognitive therapy. Okay. So I'm going to kind of talk about these separately and then we'll combine them as we go through. Okay. The behavioral approach, and again, because we have a lot of individuals interested in addiction, we'll take this from an addiction perspective. From a behavioral perspective, we take kind of the operant conditioning route or the classical conditioning route. I hope those sound familiar from your Psych 101 class. Okay. In this idea, we have a trigger in the environment. So something that creates cravings or the desire to consume alcohol, as an example. And then we have a behavior, which is the consumption, right? And then whether that is rewarding or punishing, then determines future behaviors when that trigger is put into the environment again. Now, this is something that's important to state at this point. Uh, are are addicts always socially and even on a psychological level rewarded for the use of a drug? The answer is no. Many people where they get in fights, they end up in the hospital, overdose, all of those kind of awful things that come with, especially overconsumption of some substance. The issue is that the brain, the brain is always rewarded. Okay. So while many addicts can see the problems with addiction, what's really driving this reward trigger use is the reward to the brain. So I'll just highlight just a few dealing with drugs and alcohol. Alcohol reacts with the opioid system, okay, and increases the activity within that area. Hence, a lot of people become very slumber, very sedative, and they can't feel injury as much as they do when they're sober. Okay, if we look at things like methamphetamine, it reacts to the dopamine system, right? And those who have taken intro to substance abuse or whatnot understand this, that the dopamine system is the reward system in the brain. It's what's saying, yes, I like that. Let's do that again. Okay. And if we look at dopamine, that naturally, what humans can naturally produce, we know that humans produce the most dopamine naturally when they're doing sexual activities. But this is just kind of why some things are so addictive. When we look at methamphetamine, let's say, sexual activity produces 5 units of dopamine. And this is just a fictitious example. A hit of methamphetamine will create 5 times that. So that would be 5 times 5, which will be 25 units of dopamine. Okay. And that's why those drugs can become so addictive. And they say, one time and you're an addict. Those are some of the reasons why they promote those kinds of things. So going back to the behavioral approach, we have different areas that we focus on when we look at this from an addiction. One, we can focus on the response to a trigger. So initially we say, okay, so what triggers you? Maybe it's driving by the liquor store. So we do what's called avoidance behavior for a while. We have them drive around take a different route home, as an example. I know a lot of addicts who are addicts because they sit at home and the afternoon comes on and they come up with excuses not to do something. Oh, I'm exhausted. Well, let's drink. And so being home can be a trigger. And so that's one thing that we can do. And this is just an example. One way is an avoidance skill of some type. Okay. Then we can look at the behavior. Okay. So one thing that we know about addiction is there's something called the addiction culture. Okay. Who we interact with, who supports our addiction, and those kinds of things. So behaviorally, we might work on those social relationships. Maybe it's about finding your new people. Okay. And then the third area we work on from a behavioral perspective is reward versus punishment. Um, so how do we redefine what a reward is or what a punishment is? Well, how can we reward someone for not using as an example? Okay. And then future behaviors, then we look at different coping skills. Okay. So this is all about something a person can do to resist an addictive behavior. Okay. And again, this works in the mental health arena with depression, those types of things as well. So now the cognitive approach gives a different level. It says we have a trigger, and then we have a thought, and it's that thought that results in the behavior. Okay. And then we don't necessarily go through reward or punishment, but what we do is we appraise that situation. Did we get out of it what we wanted? And then that then goes back and reinforces the trigger and thought process. Okay. So again, I'll give the example sitting on the couch, um, hits 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock. Oh, I'm already in my pajamas. I don't want to go get ready. Gosh, it's gonna get so boring. Um, you know what? I'm just gonna get a few drinks. So I go down to the liquor store in my PJs, and we go through this kind of ritual, right? And that's really what cognitive theory goes through. What are the rituals that are going on in the person's head that lead to the behaviors? What are the thoughts? What are the even the emotion area of it? And again, we'll get to that treatment later on that then lead to that ritualized behavior of going and getting that drug. Okay. So then we have the behavior and then we have the appraisal. The advantage of this is if we combined it, okay, we now have one other area that we can put some type of coping skill in. We can work on the individual's thought processes. So with behavioral approach, we can look at triggers and then the behavior, the reward and punishment. And then with cognitive, we can look at two areas. One, the thoughts that lead to use, and also the way that they appraise the situation. Okay. So this is kind of an example using the addiction, but again, also this also is something that works with mental health. So in depression, and this comes from Aaron Beck's theory of cognitive therapy, is that depressed people have something called a ruminatory thinking process that basically goes and looks at a behavior during the day. So I got yelled at by my boss. Boom, right here, right? So here's the start of the cycle. I must be an awful person. The only people who get yelled at are people who do wrong. I must be a bad person. And then it goes again. And then what we do is then we look for reinforcing behaviors, other behaviors that then reinforce that thought cycle. And the goal in treating depression is to challenge those thoughts, to challenge that rumination, to put some type of coping skills that does things like thought stoppers. So once you start thinking this way, you should go read a book or you should go do something that makes you feel good instead of focusing on that rumination cycle. Okay. So these are both two approaches. One deals with thoughts, the other one deals with behavior. And when we combine the two, we're working both with the individual's thoughts and we're working with the individual's behaviors. Okay. So I do want to bring something up because we're very much in a culturally based treatment. Most of you, I assume or I think will be working with, your tribe, your people. And there's growing evidence and building off of this cognitive behavioral therapy and stuff, is there's growing evidence that while we're doing this process, we should be looking at the person's whole identity. Okay. Um, so identity as a person, identity as their culture, identity of who they are, whether man, woman, non-binary, whatever view the person is. And there's growing evidence that you actually increase the efficacy of this cognitive behavioral therapy when you focus also on developing the person's identity as a human being. And I'll bring up a quick example from literature dealing with Native American communities is a lot of Native American communities are going through a process where their youth are trying to reject their Native American identity. And the corollaries of that is we're seeing increased rates of addiction, increased rates of not being successful in school, increased rates of criminal or troubling behavior. And it's directly associated with this loss of things like language, this this perception that being Native American isn't what I want to do. I want to be an American and no longer identify with my Native American community. But what we have found working with youth, it specifically in Native American communities, is if you can help them bring back a sense of who they are and where they come from, that basically their Native American roots, but also parts of what carries them in here being in a Western world, but really focusing on this, we find actually decreases a lot of the troubled behaviors we see in Native American youth. And so my point being, and this goes with any client that we work with, we'll talk about this class about things like historical trauma, why people reject their own identity and who they are, and how that leads to wrongdoing. And we'll do that when we get to social identity theory here in a couple weeks, because it has a basis in group work as well, and the identity that people start to grow as a group member and the potential consequences of that as we move along. Okay. So we got to understand that there's other helping models that can be beneficial. Okay. Some examples are like the medical model. The medical model is very much based on reliefs of symptoms, breaking things down to their basic, even biological level. This is medical treatment, that's medication, all of those things. The limitations of the medical model is it is treating symptoms, but it's not necessarily treating the person. Okay. We also have examples of religious faith and spiritual based faith. In fact, in most all states, a pastor does not have to have a license to bill insurance because they're seen as equivalent to counselors and those kinds of things. And again, I do want to make this remark. If you find that a person is a religious faith or spiritually based person, this is an awesome road in, regardless of your level of spirituality. If you can get a person to use their faith in order to help them get over their or work through their addiction or work through their depression or anxiety, then do it, regardless of your own feelings about religion and faith. Okay. And then we have the example of conservative versus liberal attitudes. Okay, so conservative idea is you pull yourself up by the bootstraps, you repress that there's negativities about you, that there's a problem, and you forge forward. Okay. Versus the liberal idea where we have to understand that people are raised in a community, and it takes a community. That's saying it takes a village to raise a child. Well, this is the kind of same idea. Now, as a view as a counselor, again, you'll want to take this in account, because if someone comes in and they're extremely conservative, you need to figure out ways to use that belief system to help the person through their situation. And the same with liberal. And I will also state this, that there is a place for both conservative and liberal ideas in the helping process. But kind of, again, this is that same thing we're talking about with religion and spirituality. We want to find that ground that we can capitalize on a person's belief systems and attitudes and ideas about the way the world is. We're not here to change people. We're here to seed the ability for a person, when they decide to change, they can change for who they are as an individual. All right, I think this is a good place to stop, because I told you we were going to do a general model of helping, but I want to give these a full addressing in a class and go through each of these areas. Basically, we're going to go through the process of exploration. So this is the learning about the individual, individual learning about them, about understanding the problem. And then this is where we go to where we get our clients to have that light bulb moment that they go, oh my gosh, this is why, these are the reasons why I think I have this issue. And then the action phase is when we put some type of process in place to help the individual come out. You'll notice this isn't an Venn diagram, because these are always constantly overlapping with each other. But we'll get into that this coming Thursday. But for today, I want to stop sharing.